Take that time. We are live. We are live. And this is Senate Finance. We ran a little long on the floor today. That we passed the bill. First one of the session. And we're gonna start working our way through. Gonna do some introductions and some walkthroughs. And then I'm going to start working our way through the bills on the wall. Because it's almost February, so we have about 6 weeks. And at this point, we will continue to work on just background on ed financing. But until the education committees decide on what we're financing, we're kind of limited to any decision. So we'll continue that. But I think for the next couple of weeks, I'm going to try and get as many of these bills out of here as we can. So today we're going to continue with our walkthrough. Senator Westerman isn't here. But Michelle Child is. So Michelle, welcome. So for a number of years, I spent many mornings with Michelle in judiciary.
Yes, we don't
Usually
you in there.
Here.
So for the record, Michelle Childs, Office of Legislative Counsel, and I've been asked to do a walkthrough of S252. There's not much of a walkthrough. And I also just want to give a little caveat is that this particular bill, the request was for a rerun of something that was introduced in 2018. And so it's the language, kind of a continuation of that. And it's dealing with the record check fees that go to BCIC, and there's a record check fund, and there's a $30 fee for doing a record of Vermont criminal
BCIC for this committee.
Oh, Vermont Crime Information Center. That's the repository, the state repository that we have that criminal justice agencies can obtain records through there, but also any individual can get a copy of their of a Vermont record, conviction record.
This is Vermont records only.
Correct.
Separate from the national.
Right. I mean, BCIC does handle when they're with like criminal justice agencies are getting other records from the FBI, from NCIC. But right here, we're just talking about Vermont conviction records. And in current law, there's a provision in Title 33 and Section 6914 that authorize the commissioner for Dale to obtain background checks, conviction records for anybody who's an employee or a volunteer who's working with one of the designated agencies that receives funding from Dale. And so there's the authorization in current law. And what the bill does is you'll see in Section 1, it's amending the language in Title 20, because that's where you have the Vermont Crime Information chapter that deals with background checks. And it's amending the fee schedule there. And you'll see in Section 1, but you have to go all the way to you look at the lead-in language on page 2, subsection B. That the following types of requests are exempt from the Vermont criminal record check fee, which is currently $30. And what this does is on page 3, it adds requests made by any organization or agency administering a program of no-cost home-delivered meals for elderly Vermonters in connection with Dale. So I did reach out to Dale. I was looking at their policy. They do have a comprehensive background check policy. My understanding from general counsel at Dale is that while they do require any volunteers who are working for such an agency that's receiving funds for Dale to be administering programs, that they do require background checks, but that prospective workers and volunteers are not charged for the cost of those checks. So I know that like if you had as an agency, then the agency that was providing services, I'm not quite clear as to with regard to this proposal that's in S250. if it's the designated agency that is paying that $30 fee, or if that fee is waived. I think, what I was looking at on BCIC's website, that those types of agencies that are doing record checks for folks who work with vulnerable adults, can get a waiver. So I think if you decide to move forward on this and take it up, hearing from Stuart Schur, who is the general counsel for Dale, and would be a good idea to talk about the types of programs that are contemplated here. How is that working now? Are they just receiving a waiver of the fee? Or is the fee somehow being paid by Dale? I'm not quite there.
It probably would be a good idea to hear from Senator Westman, see what problem he's trying to solve. Fortunately.
We're going next to I see if you can.
You just send an email to the committee staff over there.
Yeah.
Let's see if you can come over. So this is giving records fees. We're not clear who's paying the fees now or what.
Right, because it's not the employees or the volunteers. There is a provision, like I said, with the NCIC that indicates that that an agency that is doing the record check fee on behalf of Dale
Yeah.
can apply for a waiver.
So we'll find out what problem we're trying to solve, and then we'll talk to their general counsel to see who is actually paying, if anybody's paying the fees. And if nobody's paying fees, maybe we need to hear from to see what that's doing to them. So, okay. Questions at this point? We'll see if we can get Senator Westman in. If not, put this on for another day. This is just our first walkthrough. Okay. Thank you. Sure. All right. I'm pretty sure everybody isn't in the room for that one. So we're going to go on to S220, an act relating to addressing education spending in fiscal year 2028 and 2029. And today we have heard from all the Bs, the Vermont Associations of Principals, Business Managers, Superintendents, and school boards. I think we've heard from all of them. I've been trying to hear from taxpayers, which is the other side of the issue. But Jake is here. I saw Jake. Yes, Jake. Come on out. You're just with the tax.
I am.
Yes.
Jake
You
Feldman.
don't have your school board hat on.
I don't know.
Okay.
And if I
Want to
slipped
be
in,
clear.
that's bad news. But Jake Feldman, Tax Department, and thanks for having us in. I have a really short presentation under my name on the website, and I'm gonna try to do that right here. I guess I kind of introduce the fact that the tax department definitely does support S220. The administration supports it, and hopefully I'm going to explain why in a second. I just need to.
I've been having trouble with this being sluggish today. I don't know if anyone else is. Sometimes this end of the hall.
Your screen's on YouTube right now, Jim.
Okay. Is it okay if I don't share? If I just do it from the thing under
We have your thing. If you can share, that it'll help the room, but
Yeah, it's not opening PowerPoint on my computer, so.
yeah, I just had a lot of trouble getting documents to open, so it may just be the this end of the hall. It's happened before.
Looking at the bill of the PowerPoint.
I'm looking at Jake's PowerPoint.
Well, my handout really doesn't have much to it, so it's pretty easy to work off the link on the website. So, thanks for having the tax department in. A few reasons why we definitely do support SQ20. It is a good bridge to the foundation formula, for a variety of reasons. So we are thinking that, the foundation formula is going to start in FY29 ideally. If it doesn't start until FY30, then Senator Bruce's plan could go another year. It's great timing to do it now. It would impact FY28 budgets, which school districts are not even close to really starting to design. FY27 has already been warned for almost all districts, so you can't really do anything about FY27, but if you are going to do something about FY28, now is the time to do it. We think that it is very well designed. A couple of years ago, there was a phase-in for the new pupil rates in Act 127 that had to do with equalized tax rates or school district tax rates. And what happened there is there's a provision that said your tax rate couldn't go up by more than 5%. So districts understood the implications of that if their tax rate can't possibly go up by more than 5%, then it's kind of like a blank check. So that is what happened with Act 127, and there had to be a course correction in February.
Never going to do that.
Yeah, it was a problem. This one is not.
Can I say that the Senate didn't create that problem? When the bill left here, it was very different than when it came out of the other body.
It still had to be voted on by everybody.
Yeah, I know. Well, but it was with further amendment, at midnight, that kind of thing.
Oh, I remember.
Yeah. So, yes, I do remember when it was proposed by the administration that schools be limited to 2%. It was a percent increase in January. And all the school budgets had been warned and written, and it was, we had to allow school budgets to be revoted. It was another extremely painful process, which I don't think any of us that went through it would ever want to go through it again.
Agreed. Yeah, it was painful. This one is not about tax rates. It's about per pupil spending. It's much more straightforward. I met with Julia Richter from JFO this morning to think about how it would play out and any potential behavioral impacts, and we were not seeing any. So we think the tax department thinks that it's very well designed. It doesn't have any cliffs in it. It leverages algebra, which I love, to have kind of like a smooth phase down. So in that way, it's
Quote of the day.
it's really, really quite good. I've been doing this for like 11 years. There's been a handful of allowable growth proposals, and this one is probably the most well designed. It's equitable because it helps close the gap between the high spenders and the low spenders by allowing the low ones to spend more. The very lowest could spend up to 9% more per pupil. The top half basically could only go to 3%. And in between, there's kind of like a slope down, which I have a little graph on the next page that shows that. There's a problem that all of us know about in the current system where the spending decisions of one district affect the taxes of another. And there are some districts that are very happy to spend more, and there are some districts which are very frugal, and the voters are very sensitive. This measure would prevent the high spenders from peaking tax capacity from the low spenders through the yield. So it kind of locks the yield, and in fact, if you pass this, you will experience in the year and possibly the year after an extremely stable yield between the commissioner's letter and when the yield bill is passed. Because there isn't much question about school spending. It would be pretty well determined.
Thank you. So one of the concerns I have is that this doesn't actually address the cost drivers in education. It imposes a cap that, you know, tells school districts you can't spend more than X percentage. And a lot of the cost drivers in education are beyond the ability of boards, as you very well know, beyond the ability of school boards to control. So they have to, you know, pay the health insurance costs. They have to pay whatever they have negotiated with their teachers union. They have to pay their utilities. They have to pay their contracts for busing, and they have to pay special education. That's not an option. They have to pay their facilities and bond costs and everything like that. So this isn't addressing some of the cost drivers. And so the things that school boards do have at their discretion to cut are often the things that impact kids the most directly, like the number of teachers and the number of, you know, humans in the building. And even some of those can't be cut because they have to provide special education services that are required by an IEP, et cetera. So I'm just concerned, and some of the quote unquote high spending districts are districts that have higher negotiated salary costs. And so they can't do anything about it. So I don't really feel like this is getting at what are the cost drivers of education. And what we're going to see is some really perverse effects where school boards are forced to cut things out of their budgets because all those costs that I just listed, plus probably more that I forgot, will go up next year. So even a limiting to 3% to 9% could be a cut in some ways. And all of our districts, as you also well know, are trying to find ways to address the cost drivers and try to reduce their expenses. And so I think that this could put, especially on some districts, really punishing effects on the things that really impact kids in their classroom. And instead of having the great if we could get them to cut the things that are the cost drivers, but those are the things that by definition are the things that are hardest to cut. And so they're going to cut the things they can cut.
Yeah, I'll say a couple of things on that. The first one is, and I'm not quite putting my school board hat on here, but I am drawing from my knowledge of school board operations, which many of you also have. So school districts in a lot of cases have reserves or fund balances available. I think that the recommended amount is between 2% and 4%. Some school districts have much more than that. And if I was on a board faced with a 3% or whatever cap in the year, I would consider applying fund balance to get under the cap.
Well, I'm going to just push back on that because I think a lot of school districts have been drawing down on those reserves in the last few years to keep their tax rates as low as they possibly can. So not as many districts probably have those reserves. And also some districts are trying to build up reserves so they can afford capital costs, to make the repairs to the buildings that are falling apart. And so if this is predicated on, we're going to let school districts use their reserves in order to do it, that also is not addressing the cost drivers. So we're just making the problem worse instead of actually addressing the cost drivers of education, which is what we need to do in order to reduce the costs or it is slow the growth.
Yeah, and I can't put my actuary hat on because I'm not an actuary. But
So you don't have that
I
happen.
don't even have that hat. But School Boards Association, Sue Siglowski was here last week, and had a pretty insightful proposal around teacher healthcare,
Mhm.
and then superintendents right after her, and school boards, school business officials concurred that what about looking at teacher healthcare and picking up the actuarial value and how it compares to, say, state employees.
Mhm.
So that would be a possibility for controlling some of the things that, maybe people say can't be controlled, but it's negotiated at the state level. So it could be an opportunity there to make this a little bit easier.
And we will be looking. We're trying to find the right people to come to talk to us about that suggestion. Well, we are working on it down the hall. One of the bills last year, we were told reduce the cost by 2 to 3%, the infusion bill.
It did.
I think what it meant is you pay 2 to 3% less of an increase than you would have otherwise. We are working on those cost drivers. The schools do negotiate their contracts. So they do at some point have some control there.
But not if they're in the middle of contract.
Not if they are in the middle.
It gets imposed. and
But
they
this
can't.
is again, 2-year kind of bridge. Today we're gonna hear from the taxpayers. We know this is going to be painful for schools, but I think we're also trying to hear about what property taxes are to your taxpayers. And next year, the proposal is that $20 million will be removed from the ed fund. And the chance that there will be a $20 million general fund transfer to cover that is
Well,
slim.
Madam Chair, I think that's a completely different issue and also hearing from taxpayers, nobody at this table is disagreeing that property tax rates are too high. So I really think that the premise that being concerned about this means that we're not concerned about property tax rates, everybody is. I'm just saying that if we want to have long-term impacts of lowering the cost, we have to look at the cost drivers and health insurance is one of those cost drivers for sure. But this doesn't look at the cost
This
driver.
is
This is just a one-time, two-time
Right.
punishment that will force school districts to cut things that are not the things that we need them to reduce costs on
Okay.
because they don't have the ability to do it in this short
So
time
then
frame.
we need to find out. And I would look to them to tell us, I haven't heard it yet, what they can reduce cost of. Because it's easy to say we can't control that cost. But we do have one of the highest costs, and it's higher than our average taxpayers can afford. So what can we do? Nobody likes mergers or bigger districts or. So what we're trying to find out is, and this is a temporary cap. And if you're a low spender, I mean, if you're a high spender, you're spending $20,000 a student. If you're a low spender, your spending is 9. That's a big variable in there. And the low spenders can spend up to 9% more. And I assume a lot of those are the ones who we would like to spend more in order to produce a better education. But we can just throw our hands up and say, we're not going to do anything, and which is pretty much what we did after 46. Act 46, and we just kind of walked away, and I think we're back having this discussion, and it's more painful today than it was then, because the costs have continued to escalate, and I don't have a silver bullet. This is a proposal. It's a short-term proposal. So I got Senator Chittenden. Thank you.
Yeah, I had it up a couple times. I would love to do a deeper dive when we say the Vermonters can't afford their property taxes. I'd like to learn more about that. I have very high property taxes. I don't like to pay property taxes, but I can afford them. And I know that many Vermonters are income sensitized, so I would like to dig into that premise a little bit more because we throw it around a lot. I was in this committee yesterday proposing a second home tax to pay for school construction, and I will just throw out some of the numbers. But before I do that, having a reserve, I'm on school board too, having a reserve is sound fiscal policy 101. So asking us to throw our reserves out just is not a sound policy. So I just bristle at that. I know we're in unprecedented times, but
I would agree if school districts were staying exactly as they are now. But assuming that this is a bridge to a foundation formula and different school districts, then, you know, what should be done with reserves and fund balance as school districts come together?
so the foundation formula is not a fait accompli. If I could throw some French out there, it's not a done deal yet. It's it's an idea that we have on the table. So yesterday talking about operations and maintenance, right, which is 200 million, 500,000 rounding up dollars a year. We have an outstanding school district debt of $480 million. Operations and maintenance went up 27.1% in fiscal year 25-26. That's $27.6 million. I have a hard time sitting here knowing that we're not investing in our infrastructure and haven't since 2007, while we're, to Senator Hardy's point, not addressing what is clearly a cost driver, a pretty significant one. And now we're saying that you need to cut, which is, I mean, a cap is a cut, basically. So I have a hard time because to me, it seems very hypocritical for us to be throwing down the hammer and not investing in critical infrastructure, which we haven't done since 2007.
Senator Chittenden, and then I'm gonna let Jake move on because we have a lot of witnesses that we need to get to.
I didn't know if you had an answer to that question.
It's not a question, just a comment.
And they aren't getting paid fees here today like the rest of us.
So two questions on part of what you've introduced so far, Jake. But before you do that, I want to say I don't see this as a punishment. I do support this approach and this discussion because I see it as a sensible step to correct a flaw in our system that is allowing districts to spread their spending decisions across the entire grandness of the state, and that has been amplified by the fact that we have declining enrollment. So I do think this is a valid discussion for a policy that's been in place previously. In your testimony, I think I heard you say that you've been thinking about perverse incentives that this might affect. There's two that come to my mind, and I'd love to hear your reaction to it. I don't think this is the case, and I too love a good algebraic equation. I'm trying to translate the language in here to what it would be. But do you see, I think I know the answer to this, do you see any incentive, I wouldn't call it perverse, if this were to go into effect? Would you think districts would be more interested in wanting to pass their budgets this year to set their comparative base for FY28 to be a higher amount, or do you, the way you see the formula is that calculation going to be independent of whatever their per pupil spending is this year?
Yeah, so Julie and I were talking about that this morning. So first of all, on current FY27 budgets, they mostly have been warned. So there's not much that can be done. There's a few districts who warn a little later, but it's really very few. I think you would want it to be a little bit higher this year, because then, you know, then that potentially gives you more room next year. Yeah, like we were looking at some examples where if you artificially get a lower per pupil spending, would that allow you more, and it doesn't work out that way. So I don't think there is an incentive there.
So the voters haven't voted yet, but yeah, I hear you. Okay, so I don't see it as a major thing, but you do see a possibility where this might motivate more voters to vote yes this year in order, because you do see some potential benefit to the calculation next year if they have higher spending per pupil this year.
I'm not sure how much the voters are gonna think about this, but school boards would to some extent. But yeah, I don't think there's much incentive to either try to make it higher or lower.
Second, last one.
Yeah.
So I do, in my understanding of this is I'm anticipating smaller school districts with smaller number of kids will feel the potential impact of this greater than larger districts because of enrollment changes. If a family moves out, takes 5 kids away out of 200, 300, would you agree with that sentiment that this has the potential to both benefit and also penalize in a larger proportional amount, smaller school districts than larger ones where a single pupil proportionally represents a much smaller percentage to affect the calculation?
I think so. It's based on per pupil, which is a good thing about it. If it was education spending, then you kind of have some issues. And if it was tax rates, then you have real issues. So it's good that it's per pupil, but I think anytime you're in a district that's losing a lot of kids, you always have a challenging situation because their system is based on per pupil spending.
So just 5 out of 100 kids is different than 5 out of 5,000 kids.
Volatility, yeah.
5 out of 100 is a rapid rate of decline.
Based on, is it 3-year cases now?
Oh, is it smoothed out?
A few years.
So it moves out a little bit.
Yeah.
We've done a lot to smooth out
Thank you.
cliffs and us.
Yeah, and if I could say one more thing from taxpayers' perspective, according to JFO, it would save about $67 million per year. So what that translates to is, in the December 1st letter next year, that means instead of saying 10%, it would be a 6% increase. It's about 4% on the average bill increase. So that's significant, and needed.
This would probably guarantee that spending in the education fund would go up north of 3%. I don't think we have a fund that's growing at 3%. I don't believe the tax base is going at 3%. This is pretty generous compared to what everybody else is dealing with.
Questions?
Oh, thank you. I just want to remind everybody that, so this year's number, the alleged 12% increase, half of that was because we brought down the tax rate last year. So half of that is because is a sort of self-imposed percentage increase and is really aggravating the conversation because the percentage increase is what people are focusing on, and that percentage was aggravated by us buying it down. And there's a proposal again on the table to do that, which would again aggravate next year's. But even still, there's the most recent numbers from Agency of Education that where school board numbers are coming in right now. It's actually dropped. I don't know if you've seen this number, but the Agency of Education yesterday gave testimony in House that the apparent 5.8% is now down to 3.5% for this year. So I also think that, school boards are doing the hard work of trying to cut their costs and reduce their budgets on their own, and us imposing something on them that isn't sensitive to where their individual cost drivers are or their collective cost drivers are is going to end up cutting educational programs for kids, especially in the higher spending districts, many of which are yours, Senator Chitton. And they are in a position where they can't cut their teacher salaries mid-contract or, so I think that being, hearing from school districts about what they have done to reduce the costs, like as the chair mentioned, the cuts in health insurance this year, it didn't bring it down to a negative, but it was a significant reduction in the healthcare, what it would have been had we not done some of the work we did, and had they not done some of the hard work at BHI to try to figure out how to cut costs. So it is sort of a conversation on false pretenses when you're just looking at the percentage growth. And I think if you're a lover of algebra, then you gotta look at that as well.
Okay, I'm gonna move us along. We have a lot of witnesses. So Jake, thank you.
Thank you.
Then move on Austin to the next. That chair comes out. So this is lower on the side. That's all you said. It doesn't love.
Well, good afternoon, folks. For the record, Austin Davis, Director of Government Affairs with the Lake Champlain Chamber. I'll try to keep my comments brief because I know you've got a number of folks, but first, I'd just like to thank you for your continued work on education transformation and continuing to grapple with all these difficult factors. I know it's not easy. I'm here today to kind of just say that in the face of just all the instability, uncertainty, and lack of predictability that we are facing at the national level, the greatest thing that this legislative body can do for Vermonters is to provide some stability, certainty, and predictability. I think Vermonters desperately want to know that you have a plan for the future, and with the legislature taking steps on education transformation, which we're appreciative of under Act 73, the plan is still hitting roadblocks and has failed to create short-term cost containment, and it will take time to develop the savings. So in the meantime, I'm financially fatigued, and that's why I'm here this afternoon to express support for some reasonable, variable, allowable growth rates. And provided your committee, which you can find on your committee page with a letter from a number of other business associations who echo that sentiment. Despite your ongoing reform efforts, we are facing another double-digit property tax increase. I understand that some of that is due to a buy down. However, that still brings us up to a very sizable property tax increase of almost 6%. Continuing a trend where property taxes have risen over 40% over the last 5 years. And I think that my members and many of the folks we work with share the perspective that some guidance from Montpelier on how school budgeting should be done over the coming fiscal years would be a very large achievement for you folks to lead in May to direct some stability to taxpayers and have them understand what the next few years look like for them. We have concerns about declining enrollment, anemic grand list growth, potential liabilities to limit grand list growth, all while spending is increasing. I'd agree with Senator Beck's comment that 3% is still outpacing our economic grand list growth in many instances. And our members in their personal and professional finances need to tailor their budgets to economic trends. And more often than not, fiscal framework and guardrails to provide limitations come from above. Similarly, every government entity in the state needs to budget in this way, where they have top-down guidance on how they should start their budget. It's not unreasonable to expect our education system to do the same. Allowable growth rates, which are variable and tailored to each school, because I also too love algebra, represent a reasonable and necessary element in interim cost containment that will give Vermonters a degree of certainty, predictability they deserve while they continue our education transformation. And such a method, as you heard from Jake, does check some important boxes. It still does allow local control and our decision-making while ensuring outliers do not affect the overall state budget and tax rate. It's also Brigham compliant. That's the rates for each school are variable and specific, and we allows the low spenders to catch up and move towards equity. Now, I just want to be clear, we don't see this as a substitute for larger scale education transformation. The Vermont education system needs that desperately. We see this as a temporary tourniquet to contain cost while we do more surgical work to move towards broader transformation. And with that, I'll take any questions.
Okay. So
Thank you, Austin, for your testimony. And I appreciate you bringing up the word stability at a time of great instability and frankly, fear and, anxiety coming from, other geographic locations in our country. But I would ask you, how do you quantify or value stability in our education system? How do you see that as playing an important role in these quote unquote unprecedented times?
I think that in this instance, money can't buy stability. We spend more per pupil than most any other state in the country. And it's not producing the results we see elsewhere in the country. And I think folks are providing state stability in other aspects of state government. I mean, the agency administration gives effectively allowable growth rates at the beginning of a fiscal year for many departments who are dealing with vulnerable populations as well. DCF, corrections, all of HS, the list goes on. I've sat on the board of a human services provider who has a similar situation where they have an allowable growth rate that is dictated by numerous stakeholders and they have to build their budget within it. I think that the education system has had the privilege of not having top-down budget guidance for a long time. And after many years of that privilege, it can feel like punishment. However, it's just the reality we all live in.
Great testimony. I want to latch on to something you said about how this is less demanding or less invasive than what Act 73 contemplates, which is absolutely true. I see the core issue of our current system is we have centralized the funding, but we still have decentralized decision making. And this still allows for a great deal of decentralized decision making while still putting a, what I would argue, a sensible and considerate cap on the overall growth relative to the so thank you for highlighting that piece.
Questions for us? Thank you.
Thank you.
Gonna move on to Jean Albert. I think you know the routine, but just introduce yourself and who you represent.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
Hi.
Hello. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Jeannie Albert and I'm from Lincoln and I'm here, as a member of the Rural School Community Alliance, steering committee. My testimony is, divided into a few parts. I know I'm going to try to be as concise as possible given that the schedule. It does cover two main topics. We talked a little bit about our support, strong support for the CSAs, the Cooperative Education Service Areas, and provide a little information about where we see the most beneficial reduction in costs that are even being seen already in the state, as well as improved service and quality. The point of that is just to provide context for why we are thinking around S220. I didn't want you to think.
No, I just wanted to ask, I know there is a cooperative service area in Southern France. I think we're gonna hear from them, but have your where are your rural schools in forming these? And if they can be formed and schools have been under all this pressure for a decade or more, why haven't they been? What keeps rural schools from forming these? Because they've suddenly become the be all and end all, but they're completely voluntary. So why haven't they happened?
I'm not going to be able to answer that completely. I do know that the one that's in Southern Vermont is built from a collaborative that had started already. And there are other collaboratives in different parts of the state which have formed. They just don't, they're not called BOCES or not called, that one is called BOCES, but they're not called a CSAP. So there are actual collaboratives already existing. And our position really is that we do support implementing them across the state, because your question really comes down to how do you make them happen? And it may be that the best way to make them happen is to designate them, get people into them.
So
with some flexibility.
Require that
we are open to that because we feel they're so beneficial, and it is hard to do it among all the other things that school districts and supervisory unions are doing.
okay, but they have not done them to date.
Some have, like I said, some of the collaboratives that exist today, I think have a lot of overlap because they do have shared services within them. They're just not as robust and they can't learn from the others that have it in other states.
I mean, are they jointly buying pencils and paper? Or are they jointly doing human resources, budgeting?
I would be happy to, you know,
I mean,
make
it
sure.
would be helpful to know what is out there.
I think there's a certain amount of sharing of expertise, consultants, other types of services, but probably the simplest would be to provide you the information,
Yeah,
provide the
but
community with that.
it's,
But, I mean, one thing to note, Madam Chair, is that the law that enabled CSIS to exist was just passed, I think, in 2024. It's it's not
Yeah.
like they've had the option of doing it for a long time. There, as Jeannie mentions, there's lots of cooperative agreements, shared transportation contracts, et cetera. That has been happening for years. And a lot of the things that are proposed that CSIS do are things that the Agency of Education used to do and no longer does.
but even with the CSIS, we're still looking at the same increased cost.
No.
No, I
if
mean,
we
with the
fully
CSIS that are
implement it.
out there now,
Well, there's
whatever
the
they're
only,
saving is being reflected in the present school budget.
Well, I
If
think
we
you should hear
expand them.
hear from the one that exists and what
Yeah.
they just started this year. So,
Yeah.
this is the first budget they're creating with. the
Yeah,
needs of
well,
kids.
I mean, I'm just trying to find out where the information is. We
yeah,
talk in theory, but this is a money committee. I need hard numbers.
yeah, and I definitely encourage you to listen, to have some come in from, and I guess you maybe already have, but there's something.
Then if you can find,
There's apparently we're hearing from this
Director,
current existing CISA director, and we had some overview
Yeah.
tests.
she has some really good numbers. I
we're
have,
getting.
what's in here is from her.
It's just, I mean, a lot of the shared services already happens, just happens at the SU level.
Yeah.
I mean, it's happening all over the state, just at the SU level.
That's not this. Yeah.
So, what, sort of setting the stage, because we recognize that were that to happen, that CSIS would be implemented statewide, that takes a couple of years to get up and running. And so this testimony just speaks to what could be beneficial about having something like a spending cap.
What's up there?
C-130 just right up the state.
Oh,
It's
HB 130 is a.
Big orange color plate.
Usually
low
they're
drop in the state
dumping
house.
rabies spade, but it's the wrong time of year for that.
Oh, no. So,
Really?
I will continue. I did actually want to say first in the testimony that, to thank Senator Little for, their leadership for their redistricting task force, and together with your co-chair, Representative Branning, you succeeded in overseeing a process that was grounded in respect for facts and evidence. And you listened to the voices and as well as other task force members. More than 5,000 Vermonters who engaged in surveys, meetings, and public comment. The Alliance supports the task force proposed 3-step phased roadmap, starting with implementation of CSIS across the state. And during this interim period, Vermont can take additional short-term steps to reduce education spending. A carefully designed cap on district spending could be part of this effort. But we do believe that it should incorporate important safeguards to address issues that are beyond the control of school districts, such as decline in pupil weights and certain extraordinary policies. It's already been talked about today. What I focused on in this testimony is looking at the allowable growth percentage, and in the testimony that I was uploaded, you'll see a kind of what's called a scatter chart with a lot of dots on it. And the point of this is one way to get at the fact that there's a very high correlation between change in district per pupil spending and change in district weighted pupils.
Yes.
You got numerators and denominators. And we're talking about math. So it's my area. I'm happy to get into it. The core though is, for this purpose is that larger increases in per pupil spending, and I was looking at fiscal year 25 to 26, are associated with larger decreases in pupil rates. And to put some numbers to that, I created a couple of tables, hypothetical districts and their sizes, LTWADM. And what you can see is that even a very small reduction in weighted pupils would require a district to reduce spending to meet the cap. Which, and by very small, I mean, 10 or 12 weighted pupils, which would not normally be a reason to cut spending necessarily, but nevertheless could force a district to do that. And what we offered is, an alternative, which is that you can generate the allowable spending percentage, but not apply it to per pupil spending, apply it to spending, education spending. And you can, obviously, there's a lot of parameters in there. There's the how you generate the percentage to begin with can be adjusted, obviously, but and it doesn't save quite as much money. It saves about 5 million less according to my modeling. But I think that it's really important because as people have already noted, these drop in pupil weighting can be very small, but still have an enormous effect. And this would at least partially protect that. A couple of other considerations, and then I'll finish, which is there may be a good reason not to to reference the highest spender. Right now, that's how the allowable percentage is described. I offered the possibility of using the excess spending threshold instead. The reason for that, I offered a couple of things, but one of them is it at least is based on inflation in part. So it's like a real metric for the change in spending. It's also familiar to districts already. That would be another reason. I listed, these are topics that have already been discussed, but in the numerator, if you want to think of it, are a lot of costs for which districts don't have any control, and thinking about ways to carve those out or just ways to manage that, I think is really important. But to finish about pupil weighting, going back to that, because I think in some ways that's the biggest concern to me, or one of the biggest, and using the percentage applied to education spending will lessen the impact on districts experiencing a drop in pupil weights, but it won't eliminate potential challenges in the most extreme cases. So I would really recommend making sure to look at those extremes, because those are the ones that could be where any kind of a cap would have maybe the most unpredictable outcomes. Even districts that, well, actually, I'll leave that out for now. And I guess I'll just add, on top of all of that is the challenge of getting accurate data. So, when you're thinking about pupil rates and managing that, you have to, of course, have that in mind.
Okay, we're hearing. Yes, on either end, there could be. School building could blow up or burn down. We could have a business move out of town and take 5 families with them. This has no appeals process, and I'm wondering if an appeal, for those beyond the norm, because 3 to 5%, the 3% are on the really high spending towns. I mean, there's got to be some wiggle room in $20,000 a student. And that cost is getting exported to the low spending towns right now, because it's all going into the ed fund and coming out. So I'm wondering if some kind of an appeals process that would, be able to deal with those truly, unanticipated or kinds of things wouldn't work. So I'm just throwing that out, and I don't expect you to answer now, but Yeah, Senator Hardy. And
Thank
then
you.
Richard.
Jeannie, thank you for your testimony. I love when you get into the math. I know you are also a lover of algebra. You make a really good point about the weighted pupils, because the way the proposal is proposed is on a per weighted pupil basis. And if there's a change in your, not only the weights themselves, but the mix of students that you
Absolutely.
have. So if your numbers of students who are living in poverty drop, or your number of ELL students drop, those are huge weights that you're no longer going to get. You might add other students, but you're dropping those students, and that will make a big change in your per pupil weighted average. And that might not necessarily change your costs, because you still have to have a full second grade class. So you can't get rid of your second grade teacher kind of, logic. So I think modeling what you're talking about on a education spending broadly and comparing it would be interesting. And I think we should ask JFO to do that. Because also your point about data is incredibly important. Our agency of education has shown time and time again that they are not capable of continuing with accurate data. And right now there's a particular problem that is brewing out there with the poverty data, the data that is used to have weighted pupils who are living in poverty because of the changes at the federal level. With the changes to Medicaid that will probably bump a whole bunch of kids off the Medicaid program, changes to SNAP that are going to bump a bunch of kids off. Those kids will no longer have direct certification. They will then not be counted as a student who is living in poverty, even if they still are a student living in poverty. And so school districts will still have to serve those students, but they won't be counted and weighted in the same way. So school districts might have a drop in their weighted students, and therefore an increase in their costs per weighted student that has nothing to do with their budget and has nothing to do with the choices they're making. It is purely a data issue, and it's purely an issue with the things that are happening at the federal level right now that is really making everything more chaotic for school districts. So I think, thank you for pointing that out. And I also, you made some other point that I just wanted to highlight, but I think that so much of this is beyond the control of school districts that this could have perverse effects just because we aren't thinking about these things or not taking into consideration. And also, Madam Chair, some of the districts with the highest per pupil costs, I'm sitting between two friends from Virgins, are districts that are small and don't have a lot of pupils, but still have to maintain a school district. So the Addison Northwest School District is a poster child for this. They have nothing more to cut. They have cut their programs down to the bone. They still have high per pupil costs because they're a smaller district. They have done everything we've asked them to do in terms of trying to merge and then shutting schools down. They've done all of the things, but they are just a small district right now and will be at least for 2 more years, if not longer, depending on how things. So they would be one of the districts that would be required to cut things that are directly pupil related in the classroom, and that would punish students.
Okay. I'm going to ask us to just have direct questions. We will all have time for statements. Direct questions for the witness, and see if we can move forward. I know it's hard for all of us. But any questions?
Under testimony, yes.
Yes, we do.
Thank you for this table on page 4 of your testimony. It does a better job eloquently visualizing my previous question. And I want to, if you can recall, you basically outlined 3 mock districts of small, medium, large. And you have a 4% across the board, a proportional decline in enrollment. The point I'm trying to make, which I get, I like that we're smoothing things, but I think it picks up on what Senator Hardy is, rather than if it was a 4%, if you just imagine one family of five. So if you just think about the impact of that family in District A versus if that family was in District B versus in District C, then you're looking at that family of five in a small district, that's a 1.7% decrease in spending capacity. And that same family in District C is a 0.2% decrease. So that was my previous concern, is the impact is going to, then that's why the question I'll frame to so as to stay consistent with the chairs. I really liked her idea about an appeals process. And I feel like I've heard that before, something that came up in previous discussions around this, where if this were to go into effect and you're one of those small districts and a family outside of your control, or for whatever reason, a house has fire and all these concentrated families with lots of kids leave your district, that's going to create some pretty undue expected pressure. Do you have any recollection of previous appeals processes that you might think would make sense for us to look at?
I don't, I'm sorry to say, but I do appreciate what you were saying before, and it is true. And just quickly, the data that I looked at for fiscal year 25 to 26 actually did include a mix of size districts. It wasn't one of these cases where just the fact of losing pupils, a significant, only affected smaller districts, but it has a greater impact. That's the way I would phrase it, based on what you were just talking about with the table. And then when I hadn't thought about until you just brought up the idea of the appeals process. I could think one of the ways I would think of it is being able to anticipate the categories that would impact certain districts, disproportionately, and a way to, report that out with some degree of, I don't know, for the lack of a better term, leniency or change in the way it works, seems like would help a lot. Thinking that through. And also the other thing I would mention, Senator Hardy, around the sort of subsets of students that maybe could benefit from a multi-year look back. It is true that ADM is 2 years. I mean, LTW ADM is 2 years, but the issue you're talking about is can be highly fluctuating.
Have you modeled, you mentioned the spending caps, have you modeled a change in the spending caps? I mean, because one thing that we can do is just adjust the spending cap, and have you looked at that?
I did a little bit because I wanted to try to get them to match like the approach I was taking to the way it was in the bill, but only just I'm happy to share whatever.
Yeah, because that's
But
something we
generally-
already have in current law, and as you say, districts are used to it, and so that's another approach that we could use instead of this hard spending cap approach.
We've had different conversations similar to this committee, when it's the House. We've struggled mightily to come up with appeals processes that we've just struggled really with coming up with those, a different way of.
We have struggled with all of these things.
Yeah, a different way to do this might be to allow for a two-part test to protect against what you're talking about, a district that just loses students. Because you could say you get what's proposed in Senate Bill 220, or at least your education spending from the year before, plus maybe some small percentage, whichever is greater, to try to protect that situation.
Education spending per pupil or per?
No, just education spending for the district. If you at least get that, maybe, or plus one or some small percent, basically a two, you qualify for whichever one gets you more resources.
Okay.
To protect.
Yeah.
We've got a couple.
Yeah.
Do you have that modeled out in previous years? I'm trying to imagine how that worked.
It's just a fallback, so you could have less money than you had.
Just do two
Okay, we're
tests.
getting into
You get the
community
higher-
discussion. Do we have questions for the
This is
witness?
some
Great
concrete to talk about.
Well, I have one quick question for Jeannie. Could you just give us an example, one more example of stranded costs? As children leave a district, and so money is pulled out of a district, what services remain? So what costs are still stranded on that district? Other than second grade, Senator Hardy said second grade, but like what else?
That's what I understand. So in other words, if there's fewer students, but this cost remain, that's what you're asking.
Or services remain?
Service, I mean, I would say, because, I think they basically all remain if we're talking about only, less than 20, or, sort of depends, maybe. But what the example I gave was 12. And presumably that's not all in one grade, right? So there's really no reason to cut if that's all you're seeing. You may have other reasons. And I would just add, thank you again, that dealing with declining enrollment or declining LTWADM is not a new thing. It's just the question of how a cap would exacerbate that, like how it would make it even more difficult to deal with a system that we have in the way.
But we have dealt with declining enrollment by raising costs per pupil. We had schools can vote whatever they want, whatever it takes to do that. The cost gets exported into the ed fund and shared by everybody else. And that's where we've been. School does not bear the full cost of the increased spending. On the other hand, I've got a school that was the last one to vote their budget, the fourth try. And I didn't have the heart to tell them, it really doesn't matter if you make these painful cuts, because your tax rate is pretty much set because everybody else has voted to spend X amount. And so I think we've reached the breaking point, and there is no easy answer. There is no unpainful answer. And we're trying to find a way forward. And, I think that's where the difficulty is coming from.
Oh, this was helpful to you.
This has been helpful. I think it's opened up some suggestions, and I think we might implement some of them. Okay, Jamie Canardi.
You let a superintendent sneak in this afternoon.
That's okay.
Sharon, I am being paid, but I do pay taxes as well, so.
We all do.
So first, my name's Jamie Canardi, and I serve as the superintendent of schools of the White River Valley Supervisory Union.
And you are, who's in your supervisor?
Yep.
I know what
Tell you-
White River is.
I'm gonna tell you, well, it's actually not White River.
Okay.
And so the towns that I serve are, I have 6 districts, and I serve Bethel, Chelsea, Granville, Hancock, Rochester, Royalton, Sharon, Stockbridge, Stratford, Tunbridge, across 3
That's
counties.
a bunch of little towns.
Yeah, and across Addison, Orange, and Windsor.
Washington County almost got Granville. It was a toss up between Granville and Braintree.
Yeah, yeah,
Might
it's
be
about an
similar.
hour and a half to get from Granville over to Stratford.
Yeah.
So I wanted to share that just to give you a little representation of who I serve. I'm coming here today and we have about 1,700 students. And I provided you a chart in my written testimony in regards to the different operation within each of those districts. 4 of the districts are unified, 2 are single town school districts. I want to be clear with you that I agree and support the intent of Act 73. And then therefore, I'm going to come to you today to advocate that we make certain the next steps we take are strategic, intentional, thoughtful, and measured. And hence, I'm going to talk to you about why there's an openness. I'm coming to you with an openness around S220, but to raise similar concerns that you've already started talking about here earlier today in regards to how we look at possible implementation of a transition mechanism. I also want to make certain that you understand that I support the work and the policy that came out of the redistricting task force that's been submitted to the legislature. And again, want to thank the senator for her work and Senator Beck in regards to the work in regards to the task force. And, within this written testimony, I think it's important to remember that we've only been implementing BOCES since 2024. I think some of us have regionally partnered to create some savings. Things like transportation contracts, right? Things like specialized programming for students in regards to needing to serve via special education services. But I do think that it ought to be mandated. And I think that you should have a date to be determined in legislation by the end of this session. To say that we all need to step up and work together in order to tackle that important work. And the special education report that was provided by the agency that really speaks to one of the areas that I think we need to really tackle within our cooperative educational service areas is this idea of how do we provide better programming for students served via IEPs by working together to create better in-house programming for us to better monitor student growth over time in-house and not being so reliant on out-of-district placements. I think right now as an educational system, we are incredibly reliant on very high cost, they say nonprofit, although I argue sometimes that they are actually for profit, intensive service providers to serve our students who have some of the most intensive needs, both socially, emotionally, and academically. And I believe we can do a lot better in-house within our system with the implementation of the cooperative educational service area model. And so I do think there's going to be major savings if enacted and a real focus. There's lots of other things we should focus on, like professional development for our teachers, bulk purchasing in regards to curricular materials, transportation services. There was a really good article in the Digger probably about a month now in regards to transportation services. And in some ways, we go out to contract for bids, but it often feels like transportation providers say, that's your area, I'm not going to bid on it. And so we go out to bid and we only have one contractor actually bidding on services. So I think there's a lot of savings that we could see quite swiftly if you were to require us to implement those.
But why don't you do it on your own?
We just started, and one of the reasons is, frankly, I think that it just came out in 2024, and everyone thought, as of last session, you were going to lump us into mega districts. And so we were waiting to see what was going to happen there.
But was there something that prohibited you in the past from?
We've already started doing some of these things, and in the White River Valley, we built a bunch of internal programming to better serve our students via special ed. I have 1,700 students, only 10 are served in out-of-district placements. And we partner with Hartford School District to create programming there regionally already for special ed servicing. And so some of these things are happening. I'm just saying that we ought to really look at providing the support and the focus to say, in the ever-changing landscape of education, by the way, we are not static. We're also coming out of the pandemic, Senator. And so to say that we need to get focused on this and try to remove some of the distractions in regards to, are these SUs and SDs going to still be in place? Are we going to be having to focus over the next 2 years on not creating a cooperative educational service, but a much larger district? Those are all the questions we have in the field right now. And so if you want us to tackle them, saying this is the focus area to do, and then, oh, by the way, we would also like you to focus on voluntary mergers at the SUSD level, because I don't talk to anyone in the educational field and or the folks that I serve in my 10 towns that think we need 52 JAs, meaning superintendents. All right, I think we all believe that we can do more efficiently than that as a state. Well, what I think, if we could layer the cooperative educational service area on, then allow for collaborative and cooperative mergers to happen, by the grassroots. And I didn't put this data into this testimony, but I'm happy to share it with you. The districts that I served that felt like they got forced merge versus the districts that had a roadmap and voluntarily merged during Act 46, the spending on all different accounts per pupil, Act 68 spending, and taxes for those taxpayers are very different because one had a roadmap and the other felt forced. We're now starting to get there. So I think making certain that we set up our criteria around voluntary mergers and making certain that those voluntary mergers have a roadmap for better outcomes for kids and then result in savings is really important over time.
I'm going to play devil's advocate because that's what the voices outside this room are saying to me. you've been able to do voluntary mergers. They haven't by and large happened. By and large. You've been able to share services. I don't think there's anything that's forced. I see you saying. And I will admit, we dropped the ball after that 46. And it's kind of brewed until we really hit a property tax crisis. Students have kept going down. The costs have kept going up, and even if you exclude healthcare, which we're working on. So if what we say is what the other side is saying is that, okay, so we say, please go forward and merge and save money. What happens? How soon can you save how much? Are we talking 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years? Because the pressure on the other side, and you'll feel that pressure on town meeting day, because I'll be surprised if budgets don't go down. How long can people bear the pressure? I'm not working, well, except here. So maybe Senator Gulick, who's still working, her husband is still working, can afford property taxes. Okay, but we're retired. We don't have any pensions. We didn't work for the state or a big company. We're living on what we saved. And my husband was a roofing salesman. I can't keep affording property taxes. And there is no place for me to downsize to, except maybe a senior apartment, which I'm not ready to do that yet. So we've got this pressure that's built up with an aging population, continued decline in students, and we're being asked to find a solution. And so there are some good ideas out there, but how can they save enough money in enough time to keep Vermont from becoming unaffordable for most of the people? And I think that's the pressure that we're dealing under. And I think we also know the schools are under a lot of pressure. They weren't set up for this declining enrollment in populations. And your buildings are all old, and I haven't heard any place that doesn't have a leaky roof. And I do know what leaky roofs cause because I took calls or what they cost, and they are not cheap on a building, a school building. So I guess that's what I'm trying
So
to
Senator,
figure out.
I can't speak for the entire.
Yeah, but I mean, in your district,
We
What
did
can you
merge,
do?
we did merge 2 supervisory unions voluntarily. We
Okay.
did prior to that 46.
how many?
And during Act 46, we went from 10 single town school districts and we merged into 6 unified school districts.
Okay,
And I had districts close their schools during Act 46 because Act 46 said they needed to.
Yeah.
And now they have non-operating grades because of that. I have a district, Rainbow Hancock, that doesn't operate a school. They closed it during Act 46. They tried to take the right steps because that is what they told they should have done. And so what I am saying to you is that I believe that the seesaws actually get to the cost drivers. Special education, transportation, professional development, buildings, as you're talking about, right? Like, so I think that actually gets to some of the mega cost drivers. It's not going to get to healthcare. We don't bargain that locally anymore. It's statewide. And what I'm saying is that we ought to get to a more clear and transparent funding formula that has less variables. I'm going to give you a specific concern that I think is going to address Senator Chittenden's concerns around the S220 cap with one of my districts, where their actual Act 68 spending's down next year, but their per pupil spending's up by over 9%. So we did cut teachers, and now we're gonna actually look at, it would have to totally wipe out programming. So I'm open to this idea of a transitional cap. I want to be clear, Senator, because I think we need to get to a well-researched change in the funding formula, because right now there's too many variables, right? Like the local decisions that boards are making, you're absolutely correct. You don't feel it on the ground. You can make cuts and actually have your Act 68 spending down, but yet your taxes are going up 20%. And so, you know, with that said, I am completely supportive. And I think the field is in regards to getting to a foundation formula or some type of change to the funding formula that's more clear and transparent. But I think we need to really research that and get it right. What I say in here is that it ought not to rely on the requirement of mega districts by Vermont standards across rural Vermont in order to balance out these weights. And I've heard we need these larger districts in order to get the weights to work within the foundation formula. And that's the concern I have. So I'd rather we take our time, make certain we get it right. And the idea I have here is that, yes, let's provide some type of transition cap to curb spending. I hear the call for that. I understand. But, you know, the example I gave you is that my district's overall expenditure budget is up less than 1% for next year. This is already board approved, right? But their per pupil spending is going up 9.28%. And we lost some pre-K students because one of the providers locally lost their licensed teacher. So I couldn't get to count those students. That's the way it works. And so those are the students I lost primarily in regards to actual enrollment. The rest was weights, as Senator Hardy said. The changes that happen at the federal level and the fact that we have universal meals. So we're asking families now to fill out household income forms. And frankly, I have real concerns about that when I look at it from an equity standpoint. Like, please tell me that you're living in poverty so we can count your student at a higher weight. That feels awful.
Yeah.
As an educator. Right. And so, so we were reliant on direct service via Medicaid numbers. And when the federal changes to Medicaid happened, I lost a whole bunch of weights. And so now that's why my per pupil spending is up 9%, when actually we did use our reserves. We are using tuition reserve money to help offset what we're asking from the ed fund for next year. So our ed fund spending is down, but my per pupil cost is up 9.28%. So I just wanted to share that, as I understand the need for a transition in the cap. I just think we got to make certain that there are provisions to ensure that situations like this are addressed.
Either or.
Yeah, and I like this idea too of it could be like some type of advisory panel, right? Or it could be something where you're actually looking at X, because our Act 68 spend is actually down. You know, in that example, we could have, spent more. But again, I'm looking my constituents in the face and saying your taxes are going up 19% next year. And it's not because of your expenditure budget. That's not all my districts. That's this one particular one. And you asked a question about mergers and savings in White River Unified District, Royalton and Bethel. Royalton tax rate is down 12.1% over the last 5 years, and Bethel's down 1.1. Again, though, that district, I say it's not a big district either. I've got 627 students in it. It's not that large, but they created a real vision in regards to how they were going to create better economies of scale by merging. And it's resulted in better programming for kids, and they're attracting more students to come to their public high school. The other thing I wanted to say to you in regards to caps real quick before I wrap up is and I think you've already mentioned it, just things that are out of our control, right? Like health insurance costs that are bargained statewide. For us, making certain that announced tuition rates at both of the elementary and secondary level are capped at whatever in regards to the cap would be for per pupil, if you want an Act 68 spending, because we all ought to be playing on the same field.
Tuition rates.
Meaning, like an example, I have Greenville Hancock, that's a non-operating district.
Okay.
If I'm gonna
That is-
comply
we
with the
should-
cap, then, you know, they
Then
send a
they-
lot of their students to Rochester Stockbridge, which is in my SU.
Yeah,
Rochester Stockbridge should not be able to announce their tuition at a percentage higher than what that cap is
Yeah.
that we've set for that per pupil.
all right,
And that should go for public and independent schools.
okay.
But how does that interplay with the allowance? Yeah, I mean, right, they can announce whatever, but the allowance that they pay.
I think that should be tackled.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. It's good. So I think you asked a good question and I'm not sure it got answered, which is, why haven't the seesaws sort of just, happened, spontaneously over the last few years? And I think other than COVID being, obviously a compelling reason, we looked at that in our redistricting committee and we have a whole section on it, which is that we don't expect this to just happen spontaneously. We are asking in our work for it to be mandated, but then for technical assistance from the AOE. We don't expect districts to be able to do this just completely on their own. They are going to need some support and some help because it's a new paradigm, right? It's something that a lot of districts haven't touched. So I hear your point, like, why hasn't it happened? And I do think that we recognize that districts have been grappling with unfunded mandates. They've been grappling with, poor support in rolling out some of the big, MTSS and other proficiency-based grading and so on and so forth. So they're constantly playing catch up. So for them to be able to suddenly pivot and start trying to do a seesaw without support, and I think Representative Holcomb talked about this the other day, like implementation is really important. So I just wanted to throw that out there. And I don't know if you want to speak to that. But...
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, Act 46, we're really just coming off of the decade. And in the midst of that work, I think there has been some real great things in outcomes for kids and frankly, some savings for taxpayers. I don't see that as a complete failure. And I also, I just got to remind folks is that there were some barriers, I think, to full implementation in regards to the pandemic was 3 years. And, we're coming out of that now in regards to school systems. And I think for some folks too, we are just waiting to see what the direction is in order to lead toward that direction. And I think some of that is some folks now are just waiting to see what direction Montpelier is going to take. And I hope, frankly, that you take the seesaw approach, that you do hold us accountable to look for voluntary mergers. And, the task force got 100 different school boards wrote to them and said, we are open to looking to merge voluntarily. So I think there is a real willingness in the field to do that. I think, as an example, if every SU or SD just found a partner, we could get that RSU and SD footprint down to 26.
Sounds like an elementary gym class. I'm a partner.
There you go.
Can I ask a question?
Yes,
Okay, so do you have suggestions for if we were to go the voluntary merger route that the task force suggested? What criteria would you use for incentivizing or heavily suggesting or whatever you want, whatever term you want to use, a voluntary merger? So like, hey, you two need to find partners in gym class. How do we identify how would you identify who that should be?
what's the carrot and what's the stick?
Well, I think,
What are the criteria first? Like, what are the characteristics?
so I think it should make sense in regards to the geographical nature, right, of the new entity,
Mhm,
right? Like, we want to make certain it's manageable.
mhm,
I think we should look at what does it mean in regards to leveling up, right? Like, we want to create some efficiency here. So I think we need to analyze if we're going to bring two entities together, is it going to make sense in regards to efficiency over time?
mhm.
Right? I think there are some mergers that we were to do right now, you're going to see due to just leveling up of contracts and things, major increases in regards to what that new entity may actually be spending. I don't think that's what anyone's looking for, right? They're looking to try to create some efficiency. So I think research needs to be done that way. And I would start with like looking at historically, like where have there already been some partnership? We have, if you look around our neighbors, SUs and SDs, we have some SUs and SDs across the state right now that are not merged, but have longstanding ties. An example I can give you is down in White River Valley, you know, separate from Winooski Valley, that the supervisory unions between exit 2 all the way up to exit 5 used to have something called the Green Mountain Collaborative. We also share a regional tech center, but that area, they used to do PD together with support from the AOE. So like there's already some regional, like long-standing roots, those boards used to get together.
With support from AOE.
But there was
That is-
support from the AOE.
AOE was
So-
actually doing something.
I think that there's just starting to look at those historical partnerships makes good sense. And I'm basing that purely out of the idea of like, this is my year 6. I was coming out of a bunch of mergers, and those mergers where those partners had worked together some and really fostered this idea of a roadmap and plan. Those mergers have been incredibly successful. The alternative when I first arrived was just trying to keep them together and see how this was going to be a benefit for kids. And if we want our leaders to be instructional leaders and not managers trying to like heal harm done because it's felt forced, then we ought to be saying to them, go find a partner, come to the state board and show why this data makes sense and why it's going to be able to work. Now, this feels a lot like Act 46, but the difference I'm saying now is Act 46 tended to focus on the merger of districts. It didn't really, we didn't reduce many supervisory units.
No.
Right? And I'm talking about having SUs and SDs focus on coming together. So there is a different, you know, a whole different layer of what I'm talking about. And I think opportunity to find even more efficiency in that matter. I lived in Washington Central, right? They went from SU to SD. That's what we did. And nothing else changed. So I'm saying like, try to like find a partner to try to create some more efficiency at that level.
Okay. Yes. Pressure.
And the state board, as you all are aware, the state board has the ability, right, to look and change the boundaries of SU. So I think you could say, we're going to give you this time to go find a partner. And then after that, the state board's going to start to analyze what might make sense.
Okay, because that's,
That's already in law.
there's pressure from the 5th floor. There's pressure from the taxpayers. With all these good things, are your budgets different? Are your costs lower than places that didn't do it? Can you make a case that by doing all these things, we lowered spending, our tax rates? You talked about Bethel.
Bethel and Middleton, Sharon, they didn't even merge, but again, I think we work really hard because we're the second largest geographical SU in the state. Like we do some BOCES stuff already within our districts. We function very much like a supervisory district, right? But as an SU, we give, I have local accountability to those boards, which I appreciate because if something's not going well, they let me know, right? And there's accountability to that. But the taxpayers in those towns hold us accountable to make certain that we are being fiscally responsible and, that we're increasing student outcomes. So, yeah, I mean, on average, if you were to look at my districts, the tax rate in Sharon's and going up about 3%. That's a small district that only operates between pre-K through 6. My districts are not going up over 40%, and our per pupil spending is less than the state average in 5 out of the 6 districts. And that's in rural, Vermont. And, again, I said, I've got my largest district, their tax rates are down over the last 5 years when the state average has been 40% on there. So yes,
Okay.
We
Done with
have,
any
we have
numbers you
good data.
Send
That
us.
I'm happy to send that data for you.
Yeah.
And provide you with that hard, data. And I just say, you know, again, I leave you with, I think you should look at S220, but look at it in combination with CSAWs, voluntary mergers at the SUSD level, and implementation of a revised funding formula, right? Like, I think there's a package there that you can put together and use S20 as a means to help with the package.
Okay,
Thank you so much. I
Thank you.
really appreciate the opportunity.
been constructive. Yes, okay. I'm gonna move on to next. Amy, weird. Maybe when this is done, I'm gonna take a short break and then do some maybe discussion about after all of this, we're thinking about going. But it's on for possible vote on Friday. But that's just to keep us moving.
All right, I will kick it off. Thank you for inviting us here this afternoon. My name is Amy Spear. I'm the president of the Vermont Chamber of Commerce. Our general perspective on 220 is that it is grounded in fiscal responsibility and economic realities that we all know very well. I think this committee has heard a lot over the course of this current biennium about the pressures that are facing Vermonters on all sides of the scale. But I do want to begin by acknowledging something important in my comments. You know, budgeting under constraint is really difficult. And I think you're seeing that here in these conversations today. I'm bringing a perspective of what property tax increases are like for the private sector, for your small businesses that you see in your community. So in the private sector, operating in a scarcity environment is never a goal. So scarcity limits innovation, it strains morale, and makes long-term planning really hard and difficult. So schools, like businesses, really want to operate in that prosperity space rather than responding to crisis, which I know that is what the work of this body is trying to get Vermont towards. So, and I'm going to be pretty brief because I know we're a little bit over on time here, so I'm going to skip forward because I did submit some written testimony. But, you know, a good takeaway here is that S220, with all the feedback you're receiving, could provide a path for education finance. For those of you that haven't seen it, the Vermont Futures Project released a competitiveness dashboard earlier this month, which does show a clear pattern in our economy. Education costs are rising much faster than our population. Workforce participation and income growth are all rising faster. So, and S220 is a proposal that attempts to reconnect education spending growth to the economic capacity that is supporting it.
Send that to Charlotte and she'll make sure we get it.
Yes, absolutely. I know a few of the senators listened to Kevin during the committee, so I'll make sure you get a link to that competitiveness dashboard. So as was mentioned earlier, I know there are years of reform conversations that have been going, but Vermont is facing another projected average property tax increase of nearly 12% that you're all acutely aware of for this coming fiscal year, following more than 40% growth over the past 5 years. So that trajectory, as I mentioned before, based on the data and the competitiveness dashboard, is really disconnected from wage growth, household income trends, and business revenue growth across the state. So that creates the scarcity constrained environment. We see this as a potential path to move away from that. So when we think of where are we now, it's a little bit more of a cost drift than sustainable growth, and getting us on a path for sustainable growth and predictability as a state is important. And this matters because property taxes don't stop the tax bill when you receive it. They're embedded in operating costs of nearly every sector. They flow through rents, housing costs for employees, goods and services, and ultimately consumer prices. So increases at this scale compound through the economy and apply affordability pressures well beyond the original levy that are in the tax bills. Vermont businesses are navigating this every day. I won't go into all the details on healthcare costs there, but overall, we're looking at education costs are growing unpredictably in a very constrained economy. A lot of unpredictability, not only from the national scale, but also at the state and local scale. When it's growing faster than the economy itself, it affects hiring, investment, it affects long-term viability, particularly for those small and medium-sized employers, which is what the vast majority of Vermont businesses are. So over time, this weakens Vermont's competitiveness and undermines our confidence in fiscal stewardship. One of the leading indicators that I recommend this committee look at in the competitive dashboard when we send it out is the economic momentum rating. Vermont ranks last in the entire country for our economic momentum. That's 4 years worth of measure for population growth, workforce demand. I think there's 4 different measures in there. We're ranked last. I think this could be a step forward for us because predictability really matters. So I also want to make sure it's clear that we don't see allowable growth as education reform. We see it as just an interim fiscal discipline, an interim activity that can be done. So I guess I'll pause there. Any questions that you have? I know very similar to testimony you heard earlier today, but happy to answer any questions that you do have about this.
Committee, any questions for Amy? Thank you for getting off.
So happens to me the last sometimes. I will send that link to the committee as well.
Okay, I'm going on to Karen Lafayette. And then. Gina Monty and Nancy Reed, and that. We'll take a short break and then we'll talk.
You want to take a short break now?
No, I think you all long enough.
So good afternoon. I have to apologize. I forgot my hearing aids today. So if you want to ask me a question, yell something with the light. So I testified in this committee last year when you were passing 454, which has now become Act 63. So I'm just going to kind of focus on some of the things that happened in that bill. You do have comprehensive testimony from me from last year if you want to ask some questions. Karen Lafayette, I'm testifying not only as a lobbyist for the Low Income Advocacy Council, but as a taxpayer in the city of Burlington. Full disclosure, I represented the city of Burlington for many years as a lobbyist, and I'm a former representative, and I served on Ways and Means when we passed Act 60. Today, I'm here to talk about Act 73 as passed and the changes to income sensitivity. The addition of the homestead exemption and the municipal tax credit, which you maintained. I also want to talk about the current situation for low and moderate income Vermonters and the effect of Act 60 on those taxpayers. Over the years, low income Vermonters, we've lost a lot of income sensitivity with caps and restrictions. And although there's been a buy down of the tax rate, the last number of years, it's a buy down on the whole tax rate, and it hasn't been targeted. So you find many low income Vermonters paying upwards of 10, 15, 20% of their income for combined property taxes, education. The restructuring law still has a number of pieces of work and many issues with respect to the redistricting, the consolidation, and specific funding formula mandates, both tremendously important and the fairly dramatic changes that are called for in Act 60. But before these changes even take place, and before we know what the effects on budgets are, on tax rates, and whether or not there's any savings to be achieved, Act 63 also makes changes in the property tax credit for education, moving away from income sensitivity to a homestead exemption, and does nothing to update the income sensitivity, leaving many low and moderate income Vermonters paying large percentages of their income for state and local property taxes. And this particular situation is exacerbated by those moderate and low income Vermonters that live in towns that have high property values and high municipal taxes. Act 60 was all about equity, access to education funds for schools across the state, and equal tax burdens for equal per pupil spending. 3/4 of Vermonters, or 70% of Vermonters, were able to pay their property taxes based on the value, based not on the value of their property, but based on their income. It remains to be seen with the return of the foundation formula and/or spending mandates or caps will continue to provide that equal access to education financing and the opportunity of the promise of Act 60 for equal educational opportunity. If you have the same per pupil spending and the same income, your tax burden would be based on your income and not on the value of your property. And that has diminished over the years. We have not updated income sensitivity in many years. We have reduced equity among taxpayers. And at a time when property values have soared and affordable housing options are scarce, we have reduced the value of the house that is income sensitized from $500K at one time to $400K. Now, we increased the income of those who could qualify for income sensitivity, but we did not increase the qualifying income for those who could receive a property tax credit for education and for municipal tax credits. That has remained at $47K for decades now in the state. And there is an $8,000 cap on property tax credit. So you currently can receive $5,600 for education tax credit and $2,400 for the municipal tax credit. Act 73 establishes a homestead exemption in place of the property tax credit for education. Under the previous law, most homestead property taxpayers were eligible for property tax credits based on the income and the house site value. Act 73 repeals the property tax credit and establishes a homestead exemption. It exempts a certain portion of a claimant's house site value from the homestead property tax, but only on the first $425,000 of value. The homestead exemption is tiered based on household income, where households with lower incomes can exempt more. It does maintain the municipal tax credit, and that's set at 3% of income that households are expected to pay, but no increase in the qualifying income, and maintains the $2,400 cap, which does nothing to address the soaring increases in property values or the rising municipal costs in many areas of the state. The effect of these caps on certain groups of people, especially lower income persons living in higher value properties over $400K, is that even though their town's income rate for education financing might be 2.5% of their income, and their cap on their municipal tax credit is 3% of their income, they are paying double that percentage for their property taxes because of the cap on the value of the house that's income sensitized, and because of the amount of the credit that is capped as well. If I'm using Burlington as an example, this is an increase to many homeowners. In 2024, property taxes on a house of $525,000 are just short of $13,000 in the city, $8,400 for education and $4,400 for the municipal tax credit. So a person of lower income Burlington living in a $525,000 house is going to pay 2.5% of their income on the first $400 of value, and the assigned property tax rate against the remaining $125,000. Even if that person qualified for maximum credits, they would always at least be paying $5,000, $13,000 in taxes, and they could get $8,000 in credits if they qualified. with a 60K household income, the total taxes on this taxpayer would be 11% of income. They get no break on the municipal taxes. With a household of $40,000 qualifying for the municipal tax credit, as well as education, they'd be paying 11.6% of their income. With the Act 73 changes, once you do all the math, and I think I did it somewhat correctly, but there's a lot of numbers here, so someone can check them if they'd like to, but I took most of the information too off of joint fiscals calculations. In Burlington, and a house assessed at $525 again with a homestead exemption for education and no break on the municipal tax, that $60,000 K person would go up to 13.4% of their income. And the person earning 40%, excuse me, let me take that back. What I did was, because the ranges go from 40 to 60, and then they go from 60. So I did for 60 and 40, and then I also did for 61 and 41. And it changes it by a couple of things, but that's one of the other inequities in the homestead exemption. Instead of by their income, is that an extra $1,000 of income puts you in a different place in terms of what you're paying. So and there's a 70% reduction for a person, a 60% reduction for a person making $60,000, and 70%, an 80% reduction for a person making $40,000. So depending on which rate you are, they actually increase for the person both making $60,000 and making $40,000. And if you get the higher rate of exemption, you get tax rate for the $40,000 person of 10.7, and for $41,000 K, you get 12% of your income, respectively, depending on which bracket you're in. So both households, the $60,000 and the $40,000, would greatly benefit by increasing or eliminating the municipal property tax credit cap to more closely reflect the intended 3% of income that's called for in statute. And the rising municipal costs and property values increasing the income limit for a break on municipal taxes. One of the inequities in the legislation and the current law is something the committee talked about last session, and that is the increase in property values in the past few years and the disparity in assessed values from region to region. If we are moving away from an income sensitivity to the homestead exemption, which seems evident in this legislation, we should try and adjust the legislation to reflect the differences in different regions. Chittenden County should get a higher exemption than on the higher than $425,000 of household value, and maybe other regions are less. This does and can reduce the cost of more rural areas and where property values are lower, and especially for people who don't have high municipal taxes, it will in fact probably lower their taxes. But for people who lower income people, moderate income people who don't qualify for the municipal tax credit or live in places where the values of their property is higher than it is in the rest of the state, and they have high municipal tax rates, this will increase their taxes. And the whole point of the savings and doing this is to make education more affordable. And this clearly doesn't do this for a certain class of people. Property values in the city, Chittenden, and other parts of the state. A typical home in the south end of Burlington has increased in value from $300K to over $500K in the past couple of years. And even though those rates have property values have been adjusted for the CLA over the years, there was a dramatic shift in the city of Burlington after reappraisal from commercial property to residential, so it was like a double effect. Because even though it's been adjusted, to be fair market value when they do that adjustment, for your education taxes, there was a shift within the city of where the value came from, because by law, you can't increase the amount of money raised with a reappraisal, but you can shift where it comes from. So that's been a problem as well. The current cap on income sensitivity of 400K is very problematic for many homeowners who saw their property values increase dramatically when we did the reappraisal. And there's no corresponding income in their households. In other words, they did nothing to increase the value of their properties. And same properties, and they're probably more in disrepair, but they just doubled in what their best value.
Kitchen or a third bath.
Excuse me?
They didn't add a new kitchen or a third bath.
Right, exactly. So, and we all well know you could have the same physical structure of a house in the city of Burlington and somewhere else in maybe Orleans County or something like that. And those people have the same incomes, and they're spending the same per pupil. And one person is going to be paying, $8,000, and the next person is going to be paying $3,000 if it's based on the value of your house and not on your income. This changes the basic premise of Act 60. Even if you spend the same amount per pupil, have the same income, the value of your property will greatly determine what you pay in property taxes, not your income. Property value does not necessarily reflect the ability to pay in many, many cases. Without an update of income sensitivity and with Act 60 as passed, many homeowners, especially those who live in towns with high property values and high municipal taxes, are not going to be able to afford their property taxes, and they have few options to change that. As Senator Cummings has brought up a number of times, many seniors are needing to age in place. There's no place to go. Even though I can sell my house in the city of Burlington for probably more than is listed on the tax rolls, I can't purchase another house in the city for that price and not have a mortgage. And I might be able to find an affordable condominium, but then I have HOA fees. And those can be as much as a mortgage payment. And we all know what the housing situation is in the city and everywhere else in the state. Finding affordable, sustainable housing is a problematic. So there's many people who have lived in their house for 40 years. They're retired. Their income has gone down. They don't have a huge amount of assets. And they're finding, no way to earn more money, and their property taxes are going up exponentially.
And when you age, you need to be in a more urban area. You are near to medical facilities. You have public transportation. If you are aging, maybe you could find a house, you could, for the same price, but it would be out somewhere, which would limit mobility.
Right.
It would change your whole social interaction and structure. You would lose your neighborhood, your family home. So there's other factors.
So in finishing, and Alex, to your question. Yeah, I've lived in the city for 71 years, and I've represented the city in the legislature. My grandfather was mayor of the city. I don't want to leave. I want to stay there, even with all its problems. So really, I'd love you to look at 3 things that could make the changes that you made in Act 60 somewhat fairer for people of moderate and low income. And that is assessing a higher property reduction, property value adjustment for different regions. So people in Burlington maybe, or in Chittenden County would get, something off, would get the reduction, the homestead exemption off of $600,000 and not $425,000. And an increase in the municipal tax credit cap the $2,400 for a number of years now, ever since the property values doubled in the city of Burlington, people are hitting that cap, and so they're paying much more than the 3% that's in statute for municipal tax credits. And we have had that credit for 55 years in this state. And that included education at that time. And then increase the amount of the income to qualify for the municipal tax credit. Anybody knows that they're raising a family or they have a house and they're making $60,000, paying, 12, 14, 15% of that income for property taxes is just substantial,
You
especially with
understand
all
that
the
if
other
we
increases.
Raise that income, your municipality probably won't like it. But that money will have to get collected. It'll raise the rates for everybody else.
That money gets paid for with the general fund. That does not, the municipality gets a check from the state for the municipal tax credit.
Collection, and that I couldn't touch it because I've tried.
Cause I'm sorry.
I'll just have to look at that because I've been told before that we couldn't touch that.
Oh, well, I'm pretty sure, if I'm remembering correctly, that it comes out of the general
It will
fund.
have to be done through the budget.
Yeah, it doesn't come out of the education fund, because I know that you guys are discussing if you didn't have any income sensitivity or homestead exemption, you could reduce the rate across the board for everybody. But the municipal tax credit that we've had for 55 years, I don't think it's ever come from comes out of the general fund, and they
Okay.
send a check to the municipality for whatever your break is.
Whoever was telling me may have had it wrong.
Okay. Yeah.
Couldn't bill them.
Unless that's changed, that's what I
It
believe.
used
but-
to be 35,000.
Yes, yeah,
When I
when it
was-
first started, that's true. Yep.
Okay, Senator Hardy, then Senator.
Thank you for your testimony. I didn't see it online. If you could send it to post it, because you had a lot of numbers in there and I was
I
having a
did,
time
I
following.
did, yeah.
The property tax exemption that I mean, I remember your testimony from last year. And you probably remember us looking at the charts and the colors and trying to find the smoothest, whatever. There is a report coming to us next December from the tax department on trying to look at some adjustments, including changing the income levels and the sort of where the change, the tiers are. So
Right.
maybe, so
Is that the tiers for the homestead exemption, or is that?
for the homestead exemption, for the new homestead exemption.
Okay,
So there's a report coming in there. If we can look at what we asked them to do, because one of the things that we could ask them if we didn't already is your first suggestion about varying house site values per region of the state, because obviously that does make a difference. And I think we talked about that. We settled on 425 as a sort of
right,
compromise.
it increased from 400, but it is
Yeah.
an exemption, it's not a.
Exactly. No, I
Yeah.
get that. I get that. And so, we could ask the tax department to look at other things. I mean, part of the reason we have the report in there is because we didn't have enough time to sort of.
Right, I remember you had that in the report.
But there's certainly more things we could ask them about. And one thing we didn't really ever talk about, the interaction between the education property tax credit amount and the levels
municipal.
and the municipal one. That we sort of like put the municipal one aside, but I think your testimony is good because it shows that they do interact in a way. And so that's another thing we could actually add to the report we get from taxes, is making recommendations on,
The
how do we,
combination.
the combination of the two, because if you're a taxpayer that qualifies for one of them, you're probably a taxpayer that qualifies for the other, and they're obviously going to have impact. You're right that the municipal tax credit is paid out of the general fund, and I point to the appropriations committee saying that, but it was never, we never talked about it in here, and I think that it's worth the conversation.
I know you ran out of time, and
Yeah.
that's the other thing, is the information from the joint fiscal shows the effect on the education tax credit. So it's kind of a little misleading.
Yeah, I mean, I think,
Because-
yeah, because there's this other piece. I
Right.
think that would be helpful to have the full effect. I mean, there were a variety of reasons we went to the exemption versus the credit.
Right, I
I
understand that.
mean, but I think having more information in that report, I think we should make changes to this part of Act 73 this year until we get the report to look at next year, and anybody who's sitting at this table next year can talk about it, and hopefully you can come back and talk to them whoever's here. But without having, we kind of set it up that we want to have more information from TAC before we make changes to it.
Right, and I
And
think-
asking for more information from them is a fair thing.
Right, I think public assets actually is doing some different things with some information. That they're providing as well.
Yeah,
And I mean, that's what we asked for is in the interim to at least update the income sensitivity, because people for 3 or 4 years now have been paying a much higher percentage.
Right, and I think that's a really good point that you're making about like, not all taxpayers are the same, and you're advocating for the low and moderate income taxpayers who are feeling the brunt of everything. And you're absolutely right. There are more things that we could do to help them and that's.
And I appreciate that. As the other thing you could look at too is I think one of the joint fiscal spreadsheets actually shows that the amount of people in that situation of high property tax towns, over $500,000 or 450, and lower incomes, it is not that many. I'm talking maybe there's 2,000-3,000. I don't know.
Yeah, there's
You know,
not
so-
that many people in each of these categories, and that's where you have to sort of make the call of like, how many people is this gonna impact? And there was one category, it was like 40 households were in it or something.
Right, but if it doesn't cost anything to do that, you could do something.
Yeah, and that's what we were
very-
trying to
yeah.
adjust.
I appreciate that.
Yeah.
I think taking another look at it and the information would greatly, increase the affordability for some of these folks that I'm talking about.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. We're gonna go back to the monthly. And thank you all for being patient with us. We got a lot to do. Hi, I'm Tina Muncy, and before I retired, I taught for a lot of years, partly in Montpelier. I was principal of Washington Village School. And then I taught at the college level. I taught teachers to be principals. So I have a little comprehension of running schools, but I really came to talk as a taxpayer in Vermont. People my age, 80 and older, are now paying as much per month for their taxes as they paid for their mortgage payments when they bought their house. And if taxes increase, you just can't afford to live here anymore. And that's a sad thing. And actually, I talked to my daughter who lives in Jeffersonville last night, and she said, would you please tell that for people my age, we understand the price of houses have gone up. But even if I can afford to buy a house, then I can't afford to pay the taxes that go with the house. And that's a problem. Now, one of the things that I did for several years was I was on the Montpelier School Board. And now I hang out in the audience to cheer them on. And they, I think, try really hard to produce a budget that is, they can educate the students of Montpelier and they can make something affordable for the people that live here. And I believe it can't be done anymore at a local level. That it's a state problem and the state has to do something about it. Now, I was on the school board when we merged with Roxbury. And Roxbury people said to me on that committee, we're not going to Northfield, which was 15 minutes away, because they'll close our school and they'll put our kids on the bus and they'll send them to their school. And we don't want that to happen. And I said to them, if you're not financially feasible, we'll close your school. And they said, oh no, Montpelier would never close Roxbury School. Well, what did we do? We had to close Roxbury School, and for two reasons. And I just want you to keep this in mind because I think it pertains to small schools across the state. I think there are two reasons. When they built those schools, we had a different education system than we have now. When they built those schools, we had no special ed. When they built those schools, children with severe disabilities did not attend public schools. So when Roxbury was an operating school in our district, if you had a special ed student that needed 20 minutes of instruction 3 times a week, special instruction, Montpelier couldn't find anybody to go there. And if you look at the whole system, Montpelier in Union School has a lot of skilled people, a lot of resources. Those same skilled people and resources couldn't be transported to Roxbury. So it was not an equitable education. So there were really two things. One is a community can't afford to run a small school with a handful of kids because it's too expensive. And then second, you're not providing an equitable education. So I think when actually Anne came to a school board meeting and the representative from Roxbury said to her and the other legislators that happened to be there that small towns will not voluntarily close a small school. It just isn't going to happen. So that goes back to the fact that locally, schools just can't do that. Yes. So we're leaving it to you. Yes, that's what I'm saying. At a state level, unlike the people that came with all those figures, I don't have any figures. And I don't have a solution to the problem. But what I will tell you, and have told our representatives, that I elected you to have some courage. So I need you to do something to fix the system so that we can afford to continue to give our students a good education. If you go up Main Street and around that 90-degree curve at the top, that was the Green Mountain School there on the left. I believe my daughter was in 2nd grade when that school was closed and the students were put into the Montpelier school system. That would have been in the 80s, early 90s maybe. But until then, that group of special needs, other students went to the weak schools that had behavioral needs, not necessarily the best place for anybody. But yes, that's a whole new set. And then decisions we've made about discipline and exclusion and other things in the school have just put the demands on teachers at a very different level than it used to be. And I understand it's a Vermont tradition to have small schools, but we just can't afford them. And as I said, I also don't think you're giving an equitable education. So maybe there. Any thoughts or questions? Thank you. You're very well. Fine. The taxpayers are the silent majority in this discussion. And it is the other side. You have family here, I have family here. Don't really want to move to New Hampshire or Florida or, but you do have to put groceries on the table and then eat. And we have been, us older people, have been paying taxes for a long time. Okay.
I just, related to the last comment you made, Tina, I would just say that I think there is a great layer to that comment. I think that small is very different at the elementary school than it is at the high school.
Oh, yeah. Yes. And if you were going to, when I talk to other taxpayers, if you were going to have a small school, kindergarten, first, second grade, however,
Yeah.
that's what Roxbury was. When we merged with them, the third and fourth
Sure.
came here and the little kids were there, and it does work better, but it's still, if you only have a small amount of kids, it's awful.
There is too small, but it is variable by grade.
Yeah,
Right.
it is. They're small and there's minute.
Yeah.
And the services, when I was principal at Washington Village, I used to say to the school board all the time, under 100 kids, you're not going to be financially feasible. But the other thing I talked to them about was the 7th and 8th grade, which I had there. And I said, I think you're putting your kids at a disadvantage. When you're in 7th and 8th grade, I can't afford a science lab. And those kids are gonna go to a high school where there are kids that came from a school that had a science lab, that had all of those.
It's harder in middle school, basically.
Yeah, yeah, it is. Thank you.
Hello. Hi, I'll be very fast. I'm Nancy Reed, and I live in Montpelier, but I lived for a long time in Randolph. I was a teacher for 30 years in elementary school in Randolph, and then I worked in higher education, and I taught in a number of teacher preparation programs. I also worked for the AOE for a while, working on teacher prep approval programs. And importantly to this conversation, I was part of the merger committee also with Tina, with we merged from Montpelier to Roxbury. And I have two quick things to say. One is immediate, like today, and the other is a little historical perspective. Today, I was a guest teacher. They called substitute teachers, they call them guest teachers in elementary. Yeah, isn't that true? At the elementary school in Montpelier. And I was in a 4th grade class, and there were 3 students from Roxbury. And I asked them, are you a Roxbury student? And the 3 of them came, 3 girls, and said, yeah, we came from Roxbury. Now they've had a full year to sort of get used to it and blend. But I said, how was it? I mean, how do you like the school? Is it better? Is it worse? Is it the same? They all said it's much better. And I said, well, what made it work for you? And they said, thought a minute and said, it just took some time to get used to. And so I think that's kind of important to know. They blended in. I didn't know who they were, which ones were that. And I think they blended in. They liked the size. They said, I like all the people. I like the size. I like different teachers. That's just from today. Historically, I'd like to share something. I lived for a while in West Brookfield, which is a community that is tiny, and it used to have a school, a post office, and a little sawmill. And it had a one-room schoolhouse right in the middle. And I got to know a woman named Stella who taught in that school. She's long gone, but she taught in there. And she was ultimately the first principal of the big school, which was the Brookfield School, when they closed down all the little one-room schoolhouses and went into the Brookfield School. Now, the big Brookfield School is now on the verge of closing. So historically, now interestingly, I did a little AI research. In 1900, there were 1,500 one-room schoolhouses. In 1967, there were 20, and now there's one that you know. Interestingly, when they moved from the one-room schoolhouses to the big schools like Brookfield and Braintree, the issues were resistance to change, loss of local identity, loss of democracy, resistance to state control, and the fear of bigness. That was one-room schoolhouses to Brookfield. And now, so now look where we are now. It's the same issue. I taught in Randolph. Randolph went and merged East Randolph Center to the big school in Randolph.
It is a big school.
And it is a big school. And parents from East Randolph on the farms would say they do drugs in that school. It's just too big. This is a theme here. And now they all are in what's called, and since 2000, they're in the Randolph Elementary School. They're all together. I taught there for 10 years. I never knew who was from East Randolph and who was from down the street. As they did with the little girls from Roxbury, it took some time and they just got used to it. And so I just think it's important to think about this over time. We go from, I'm not sure we really want to go back to the one-room schoolhouses. maybe some people would, but this is sort of an inevitable evolution. I think it's an evolution. There might be people that say it's a devolution. I think it's an evolution, and the kids just get used to it.
And the number of kids is declining. You probably, you had that, if you had 10 kids in that one room schoolhouse, you probably have 2 or 3.
Correct.
At this point.
Correct. And I would echo Tina's, the needs now, right now at the local school, you have some Afghan children, you have, you have lots of needs. And the one thing that we didn't talk about Roxbury School is that you can't get, it's about FTE, full-time equivalent. You would get a 0.3 FTE nurse and a 0.2 FTE librarian. You just can't find the quality to support all the services in a small school because you're looking at putting together little tiny bits of FTE, whereas in a bigger school, you have full-time FTEs.
I've heard that. I know they had in 32 districts, they had a art teacher that traveled between the schools. They couldn't keep an art teacher because having to load up all your art supplies,
For sure.
put it in your car,
That's right.
move it to the next school, load it up.
And that's what they
again.
did in Randolph, when the Randolph had all this stuff and they put it in the special services, the Title I people, all the services would drive over the hill, Randolph Center, and then down to East Randolph with all whatever they needed. So
And eventually you find a full-time job, Emily.
as you should.
Yeah.
Not to mention the mileage and the time off task that you're spending driving as opposed to teaching.
I just have a process question. Right. Madam Chair, you like to say this is the money committee. I'm just wondering, have you presented as a Senate education? Because you're really talking the governance and you're talking.
I was worried that I was in the wrong committee, but I
So-
just thought I'd share.
Well, are you going to go to that committee?
I don't know.
Should-
We were invited to come here. We weren't invited to
Oh,
come
okay.
The
there.
woman at the other end of the table.
Go there too.
Yeah,
there too.
anybody who's a taxpayer that would like to come to talk about the impact, because the professionals in the schools are well organized. Your average taxpayers only heard from on town meeting day.
Right.
And then they, unless there's 3 or 4 more school votes, they disappear for a year and they aren't here. And it's important that we hear both sides of the question.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Committee, take a 10-minute break.
Yeah.
And then I just want to have some discussion. So I know what I need to ask that. I'm going to give